Eleanor Ashby kept walking. The path back to Wyndham Hall stretched through the copper-leafed oaks. She followed it with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who has decided that stopping is not an option. The air smelled of cold earth and dying leaves. Her hands, clasped at her waist, were perfectly still. 3 years. 3 years she had believed him. The clearing was behind her now, and Victor Hale was already gone. She had not watched him go. She had simply turned and walked, because that was the only thing left to do. The words he had said were still hanging in the cold air somewhere behind her, but Eleanor refused to let them catch up. She was 20 years old, 6 weeks pregnant, and entirely alone. Her father had been dead 2 years. There was no dowry. There was no plan. There had been a plan. 3 years of a plan built in secret, built on promises Victor had made in whispers when no one else was listening. He had called her his greatest secret. He had called her the one woman who understood him. He had told her again and again that when the time was right, when his family's expectations were managed, when he had secured his position, then he would come to her openly. She had believed him. She had been 20 years old, and she had believed every word of it. And then this afternoon she had told him about the child. And Victor Hale, Lord Hale, smooth and immovable, had told her exactly what she was worth. If she named him, he said, he would call her a whore to the entire village. He would walk away clean, his word against hers, the gentleman, or the girl from the cottage. She would be ruined in an afternoon. Everyone she loved would be touched by it. Her sister Sophia, whose husband Edmund was cousin to the Duke of Wyndham, whose family dinner was in progress at this very moment inside the hall whose lights Eleanor could see through the trees. He had not raised his voice. He had spoken in that careful, intimate tone he used when he was most serious. And then he had gone. Desperation was pressing against her chest. But Eleanor Ashby had her father's nature, and her father had been a man who kept meticulous accounts. And the first rule of meticulous accounts was this: you do not fall apart in the middle of an open field. You take stock, you find the next column, you move. She moved. The hall rose ahead of her through the trees. Wyndham Hall was not a house you approached casually. It sat in its grounds the way a crown sits on a table, as if it had never needed to announce itself, as if announcing itself would be beneath it. The stone was pale in the fading light, the windows blazing with the warmth of the birthday dinner in progress, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the drive and felt the full weight of what she was carrying. Sophia did not know. No one knew. And for a little while longer, Eleanor could still choose what happened next. The cage, when she laid it out precisely in her mind, had 3 walls. The first wall, no money. Her father's tailoring business had left debts, not savings. She lived in the cottage by the grace of Sophia's kindness. She had no income, no property, nothing in her name. The second wall, Victor's threat. The moment she named him, he would destroy her story before she could tell it. He was a lord. She was a country girl in a handed-down gown. She already knew how that argument ended. The third wall, proximity. Sophia's husband was Edmund Wyndham, cousin to the Duke himself. If Eleanor's shame became public, it would not stay in the village. It would reach Edmund's door. From Edmund's door, it would reach the Duke's. The scandal would swallow everyone she loved before it swallowed her. 3 walls, no roof, not yet, which meant there was still something like sky above her. Eleanor was a woman who found what was not yet lost. She walked toward the hall. The dinner was visible through the tall windows of the ground floor, the soft shapes of Sophia and Edmund, and the other guests moving behind the glass. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the building rather than entering directly. She needed a moment longer, just a moment, to arrange her face, to put everything she was feeling into the column where it belonged so she could function. As she walked the long south wall, her eyes moved across the windows as they passed, counting them the way she always counted things. And she stopped. One window was lit differently from the rest. Not the warm gold of the dining room, not the gathered brightness of the drawing room. This was a quieter light, a reading lamp set close to the glass. The library. Eleanor did not know who would be sitting alone in the Wyndham Hall library while the birthday dinner filled every other room with noise and candlelight. She had not thought to ask. She had been too consumed with her own walls to notice the light. But later, when she tried to remember when her life had turned, she would come back to this moment. The walking, the cold, the single lit window in the library, set apart from all the rest. She had no idea that the man sitting alone behind that glass would become the only door her impossible situation had left. Eleanor had arranged her face before she walked through the door. She was accomplished at this. 3 years of Victor Hale had given her a talent for composure she had never asked for and would never have chosen. She could sit at a dinner table with her hands folded and her expression perfectly pleasant, while her interior was conducting a completely separate conversation. She had gotten very good at it. Sophia's birthday dinner was bright with candles, and the particular noise that happens when a dozen people gather in a room that is too fine for most of them, and everyone is working slightly too hard at appearing comfortable. Eleanor found her sister across the room immediately. Sophia was laughing at something Edmund had said, her dark eyes bright, the happiness on her face entirely genuine. Eleanor was glad of it. Sophia's happiness had always felt like something worth protecting. She had not yet told Sophia. She would not tell her tonight. Tonight she would simply survive the dinner, smile at the right moments, and then she would go home and think. She was very good at thinking. Her father had made her good at it. Richard Ashby had been a country tailor in the village of Haverwick, a small man with large hands and the most precise mind Eleanor had ever encountered. He had kept accounts the way other men kept faith, with rigour and daily attention, and the calm conviction that the numbers, if you were honest with them, would always tell you the truth. He had taught Eleanor his system when she was 12 years old. She could balance a column in her head before she could write a full sentence in copperplate. She had loved it. She had loved the order of it, the certainty. A figure that did not balance announced itself immediately. No ambiguity, no room for the comfortable lie. He had died when Eleanor was 17, leaving debts and a cottage, and a grief so large she could only carry it by keeping it very small and very still. Victor had appeared 6 months after the funeral. She had known even then that she should be careful. She was not a fool, but she had been 17 and grieving and very alone, and Victor Hale was patient and charming, and he had more time than anyone she had ever met. He had pursued her in absolute secrecy for 3 years, not because he was ashamed of her, he said, but because his family's expectations were complicated, and he did not want her subjected to the scrutiny that would come too soon if they moved publicly. He said it so reasonably. He said it every time she worried, and every time she believed him, and every time she felt slightly ashamed of herself for worrying. She had been so very stupid. The word settled in her chest, and she made herself acknowledge it squarely, the way her father had taught her to acknowledge an error in the accounts. Clearly, completely, without drama, because dramatic responses to errors only made the correction harder. She had been stupid. She had trusted the wrong man for 3 years. The child now 6 weeks formed beneath her ribs was the proof of it. She could not unknow it. She could only move forward. The cage, when she laid it out now in the candlelit warmth of the birthday dinner, had 3 walls as precise as ledger columns. The first wall was money. Her father's tailoring business had left debts that Sophia's marriage to Edmund Wyndham had absorbed, quietly and without being asked, in the way that Sophia absorbed problems. Eleanor lived in the cottage at the edge of the estate. She had no income of her own, no property, nothing in her name that a child could be secured against. A child without a name, in a cottage, with a mother who could not work. The arithmetic of it was brutal, and she did not look away from it. The second wall was Victor's threat. He had not been unkind when he said it. That was what made it so effective. He had simply laid out the reality in the same tone he used for everything, calm, certain, undeniable. If she named him, he would deny it. His word against hers, the lord or the tailor's daughter. He had more money, more connections, more credibility. He had spent 3 years building a picture of himself as a respectable man, and she had no counter-evidence beyond her own word and a child that shared his chin. He would call her a whore before the village and walk away clean. She believed him. The third wall was Sophia. Edmund Wyndham was cousin to the Duke of Wyndham, and Wyndham Hall stood 2 miles from the cottage where Eleanor slept. If Eleanor's shame became public, and Victor would make it public, precisely and without hesitation the moment she moved against him, it would not stay in the village. It would reach Edmund. It would reach the estate. It would reach the Wyndham name, and the Wyndham name was the ceiling above everything Sophia had built. Eleanor could destroy herself. She would not destroy Sophia. 3 walls. She sat at the birthday dinner and watched the candles and thought about columns. She heard about the Duke of Wyndham before she saw him. Edmund mentioned him in passing. His cousin had returned from London for Sophia's birthday, had been meant to join the dinner but had declined the table in favour of the library. which was apparently not unusual behaviour for the Duke of Wyndham. Edmund delivered this without apology, because Edmund had known his cousin since childhood and had long since ceased to be surprised by him. Sophia delivered a look across the table at Eleanor that said, very plainly, "Men." Then Dorothea Wyndham arrived late to the dinner, and Eleanor stopped thinking about the Duke entirely. James Wyndham's mother entered a room the way cold air entered a room. Not aggressively, not with drama, but with an immediate and total effect on the temperature. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed in the formal black she had apparently worn since her elder son Henry's death 3 years ago, with silver hair drawn back severely and eyes that were the colour of a winter sky at midday. She moved to her seat with the assurance of a woman who had never, in her life, considered whether she was welcome somewhere. She looked at Eleanor once, briefly, and then looked away. The look lasted long enough to take a full inventory and render a judgment. Eleanor felt it hit her square in the chest. The cut came 2 courses later. Dorothea had been discussing the county's marriage prospects. It was the kind of conversation she apparently conducted as a matter of routine, the way other people discuss the weather, and she had reached Eleanor's name in the natural course of the topic. "Miss Ashby is very fortunate to be included among us," Dorothea said. She said it pleasantly. She said it to no one in particular, which meant she said it to everyone. Her family's circumstances, after all. The connection to Sophia is not a small thing for a girl in her position. Very fortunate indeed. The table did not move. Eleanor's fork continued its correct journey from the plate to her mouth. She did not look up. She did not allow the flush she felt rising to reach her face. Humiliation flooded through her, hot, immediate, and deeply familiar, because Dorothea was not the first person who had ever spoken about Eleanor's family as a kind of unfortunate fact, and she would not be the last. But the heat of it was still real. The cut was real. The deliberate, gracious, entirely deniable cruelty of it was real. Sophia said, very clearly, "Eleanor is my sister, Dorothea, and has always been welcome in this house as my sister." Dorothea did not look at Eleanor when she delivered the reply, which was, Eleanor had learned, worse than if she had. "Of course," Dorothea said, and smiled, and returned to her dinner. Eleanor picked up her fork and kept her face perfectly still. She slipped away from the dinner during the remove. She did not plan it. Her body simply decided between one breath and the next that it could not sustain the performance for another course, that what she needed right now was 30 seconds of silence and a room with no one watching her face. She murmured something to Sophia about needing a moment, and Sophia, who always understood without being told, pressed her hand and let her go. The hallway outside the dining room was cool and quiet. The sounds of the dinner muffled behind her as she moved deeper into the house. She had been to Wyndham Hall enough times to know its layout in the way, you know, a house you have visited since childhood. Not precisely, not formally, but by instinct. The library was at the end of the corridor, and she was walking toward it before she had consciously decided to go. The room was smaller than she expected from the outside. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old leather and cold ash from a fireplace that had not been lit recently. A reading lamp burned on the desk near the window, the same lamp she had seen from the drive, the light that was separate from the rest. She had not noticed when she walked toward it from the drive that the desk was occupied, but the desk was empty now. Whoever had been sitting here had recently gone. The lamp was still burning, and there was an open book turned face down on the leather surface, and beside the book, spread open and weighted at the corners, was the estate ledger. Eleanor crossed to the desk and looked down at it, because she could not help it. It was the nature she had been given. The columns were meticulous at first glance. Her eye moved across the figures, trade accounts, quarterly settlements, the steady rhythm of an estate's income properly recorded. And then, 4 columns from the left, a discrepancy. Not a large one. Not the kind that would announce itself to someone not trained to look for it. But her father had trained her to look for exactly this. A figure that balanced on the surface but did not balance when you traced it back to its source. The credit was listed. The corresponding debit had been moved, recategorized, assigned to a line that should not have absorbed this particular charge. Eleanor stared at it. Her finger moved to the page and stopped just short of touching it. Someone had changed this entry. Not incorrectly, not through error. The handwriting was different from the surrounding entries, confident, deliberate, and slightly too neat. Someone had gone back to this column and corrected it after the fact. She straightened. She did not know whose ledger this was or what the account line meant. She did not know enough of the estate's accounts to say with certainty what the error signified, but she knew, with the absolute clarity her father had given her, that it was not an accident. The library door opened. Eleanor turned. The man in the doorway was tall, tall enough that the frame accommodated him with a particular economy of someone who had learned to move through spaces slightly too small for him. Dark hair, dishevelled in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it. Grey-green eyes that found her immediately, and stayed there with an expression she could not immediately read. He was not what she had expected the Duke of Wyndham to look like. She had expected someone more polished, more like what a duke was supposed to be. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger she had just been studying. He looked at her again. "The library," he said, "is not part of the tour." He did not say it unkindly, but he said it as if he meant it, and the cold was in his voice before he even finished the sentence. Eleanor held his gaze. She had survived Dorothea's cut 20 minutes ago. She could survive this. "I was not touring," she said. "I was sitting, or I was about to. I am sorry. I did not realize anyone was using the room." He said nothing for a moment. He came into the library without asking permission to enter it, as if the idea that he required permission had genuinely not occurred to him, and he crossed to the desk and looked down at the open ledger with an expression that was difficult to interpret. 3 walls, every exit closed, and the Duke of Wyndham was standing between Eleanor and the door, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. She had no idea at all. He offered her his handkerchief. He did not ask if she was crying. He did not look at her face to confirm it. He simply crossed to the desk and set the folded square of linen on the surface near her hand, and then he moved away to the window and looked out at the dark grounds as if he had simply come into the room to admire the view. Eleanor stared at the handkerchief. She had been holding herself together with both hands for the past 6 hours. The small, practical kindness of a piece of linen undid something in her chest that she could not immediately recover. She picked it up. She pressed it briefly to her eyes. She did not cry, not properly, not with the full weight of the evening behind it, but she allowed herself to stop performing composure for exactly 4 seconds, and then she put the handkerchief back on the desk and straightened. "Thank you," she said. James Wyndham turned from the window. He had eyes that did not waver. She had noticed that immediately. "What has happened?" he said. It was not a gentle question. It was a practical one, the same tone he might use to ask why the estate accounts were not reconciled. But he had offered his handkerchief first, and that mattered. Eleanor looked at the window. She looked at the ledger still open on the desk. She looked at the handkerchief in her hand. And then she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do tonight, because there was no one else in the room, and she had been carrying it alone since the afternoon, and every exit was closed. "I am pregnant," she said. "The father has abandoned me, and will call me a whore before the village if I name him. I have no money. I have no options. I was sitting in your library because I needed 30 seconds when no one was watching my face." She said it without drama. She said it the way her father had taught her to state an error in the accounts, clearly, completely without embellishment, because embellishment only made the correction harder. James Wyndham looked at her for a long moment with an expression she still could not read. "How far along?" he said. He asked questions. He asked them in the same precise, uninflected tone he might use to question a steward about a quarterly settlement. How many weeks? Was there any documentation, letters, witnesses, anything that could be presented if he named himself? Was her family aware of the situation? Had she spoken to the man's family? Eleanor answered everything. She had not, until this moment, realized how much it cost to carry information in silence. Answering was almost a relief. James received each answer the way a man receives estate figures, noting them, filing them, proceeding to the next column without visible reaction. He did not express sympathy. He did not express judgment. His face was the face of a man who was thinking about a problem, and the problem happened to be Eleanor's entire life. It should have felt clinical. It did feel clinical, and yet he had given her his handkerchief before he asked anything at all. "Your situation requires resolution in a very short period," he said, when she had told him everything. And resolution, at this point, means a name for the child, and a position from which you cannot be socially destroyed. Those are the 2 facts. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I can provide both." She looked at him fully for the first time. He was standing near the fireplace, cold because the fire had not been lit for days, and his expression had not changed from the expression he had worn when he walked in and found her at the desk. It was controlled, completely controlled. The face of a man who kept everything locked away and let no one near it. "You are offering to marry me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He said, "Because my conscience will not allow what is being done to you and this child to continue. The man whose duty it is to act has refused to act. His conscience will apparently allow it. Mine will not." It was a formal statement. It was almost cold in its precision. Eleanor studied his face for the thing that was not being said, because there always was something not being said, and what she found was nothing she could name, just the mask, and behind it a density she could not see into. "And what do you receive from this arrangement?" she said. James was quiet for a moment. "An end," he said, "to certain questions about my continued bachelorhood that my mother has been pressing upon me since my brother's death." He said it flatly, as if this were also a ledger entry. "That is a separate matter. The relevant fact is that I am in a position to offer what you need, and the child is innocent of what its father chose. The power was entirely his, and both of them knew it. Eleanor had nothing to offer in return. She had no dowry, no connections, no social currency. She had a sharp mind and a handful of letters from a man who would deny writing them, and a child that would be called illegitimate from the first breath if Eleanor remained unmarried. Against this, James Wyndham held a name, a title, a fortune, and enough standing to face down Victor Hale's word, with something rather more persuasive than her own. She accepted the proposal. She accepted it plainly, without performance, because she was not a woman who dressed necessity up in gratitude she did not feel. "I accept," she said. "And I should tell you, I have nothing to give you in return for this. No money, no family connections, nothing that will be useful to your household or your position. I am aware that this is an extremely one-sided arrangement." James looked at her with something that was neither warmth nor its absence, something she could not place. "I would not say nothing," he said. She waited. "You have good sense," he said. "That is not nothing, and the child will not be punished for the sins of its father." He said it simply. He said it without heat, without performance, without any of the signs Eleanor associated with a man who was trying to be kind. He said it the way he said everything, as a fact, from behind the mask, with no indication that it had cost him anything. But Eleanor looked at him directly when he said it, and he did not look away. For one beat, just one, there was something in his grey-green eyes that was not the mask, something she recognized. It looked like a man who had decided that this particular thing mattered, even if he had not decided why. Then his expression settled back into its controlled stillness, and the moment closed. "I will arrange a special license," he said. "The ceremony will be private. You will be moved to Wyndham Hall within the week." The announcement did not go as Eleanor had expected, because she had not known what to expect. James delivered it with the same controlled calm he had used to propose, direct, brief, entirely without sentiment. He had spoken to Edmund first, privately. Edmund had apparently agreed to manage Sophia's reaction, because Sophia's face, when James stated the news at the assembled dinner table, showed not the alarm Eleanor had feared, but something complicated and watchful. Dorothea's face showed nothing at all, which was worse. "James," Dorothea said, when the announcement was complete. Her voice was a careful instrument. "This is rather sudden." "It is," James said. He did not elaborate. "Miss Ashby's family," Dorothea began. "Eleanor's family," James said, in exactly the tone Eleanor would have wanted, and could not have deployed herself, "is Sophia's family, which makes it, in the relevant ways, my family as well. I'm content with the arrangement." He said it without warmth. He said it as a fact. The fact was impassable. Everyone at the table could feel it. Dorothea looked at Eleanor with cold eyes and said nothing further. Sophia came to Eleanor's room later that night. "Tell me the truth," Sophia said, sitting on the edge of Eleanor's bed with her hands in her lap, her birthday flowers still pinned in her hair. Eleanor looked at her sister's face. The love in it was so obvious, so entirely without condition, that it was almost painful to look at directly. "I'm going to be all right," Eleanor said. "That is not the truth." "It is the beginning of it." Sophia pressed Eleanor's hand and did not push further. She understood that there were things Eleanor was not ready to say, and that pressing would only make her retreat. She stayed for an hour. She held Eleanor's hand. She left when Eleanor's eyes grew heavy. It was the most Sophia could offer. It was everything. The wedding was everything it needed to be, and nothing more. Private Quick, witnessed only by the vicar, Mr. Hollis and Agnes, who had been with Eleanor since childhood, and whose face throughout the brief ceremony was perfectly composed and entirely illegible. The ring went on Eleanor's finger, plain gold, Wyndham family, worn smooth by generations, and James said the words with the gravity of a man who meant them in the technical sense. Eleanor said them back. In the rose suite afterward, James helped her with the 12 buttons on her bodice. He stood behind her and unfastened each one with a precision that was almost mechanical, not cold but deliberate, as if he had set himself a task and was completing it correctly. Eleanor stood very still. The buttons were small pearl buttons set at the back, and she had not thought, until this moment, that she would need someone's hands to reach them. Her fingers had not been able to manage the angle. He unfastened the last button and stepped back. He did not linger. He did not make anything of it. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. He crossed to the settee against the far wall where a pillow and a folded blanket had been placed. She had not done this. Agnes must have arranged it, or Mrs. Holt, who had appeared at the door of the Rose Suite 3 hours earlier with an expression of absolute maternal authority, and told James with the directness of a woman who had once changed his linens and had therefore earned certain rights, that she would not be having any nonsense in the management of the new Duchess's comfort. James had received this instruction in silence, and with the look of a man who had learned, sometime in childhood, that Mrs. Holt was not a force that could be argued with. Eleanor changed behind the dressing screen and lay down in the bed. She lay still in the dark and listened to the quiet of the house. The settee creaked once as James settled. The candles on the nightstand burned low. From somewhere outside the window, the autumn wind moved through the last of the oak leaves. A moment later she heard James at the washstand, and then the small, careful sounds of a man doing something quietly, so as not to wake her. She did not move. She kept her eyes on the ceiling. Then the light went out. In the morning, the housekeeper would change the bed linens. Eleanor would not ask how they had come to be marked in the way the linens of a wedding night were supposed to be marked. She understood, without being told, that James had managed it. She understood what it had cost, and she understood that he had done it without telling her, without making it a transaction between them, without asking for anything in return. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who would do that without ceremony. She thought about the ledger error she had seen on the desk. She thought about what he had said in the library, "The child will not be punished for the sins of its father," and she thought about what kind of man said a thing like that and then closed his face again before you could see behind it. She did not have an answer. She had a marriage. She had the settled dark of a house that was now, in the legal and irrevocable sense, hers. The door of Wyndham Hall had closed behind her, and she was inside it, and whatever came next, she was not facing it alone. That was something. She was not yet sure it was enough, but it was something. The London house was larger than she had expected, and James showed her through it with the detached efficiency of a man reciting a steward's report. "Drawing room," he said, opening a door to a room full of silk curtains and gilded chairs. "Dining room, morning room. You may use any of these." "May I use the library?" Eleanor said. "It is the house's best room," he said. "I would not have brought you to London if I intended to bar you from the library." Eleanor went into the library and had to stop herself from making an undignified noise. It was 2 stories tall, with a wrought-iron gallery running around the upper level, and every surface was books, leather-backed, cloth-backed, paper-wrapped, stacked and standing and tucked at angles where they did not fit anywhere else. In the far corner, half hidden behind a row of geography volumes, was a section of shelf that swung out at a slight angle. She touched it. It swung. Behind it was a compartment roughly the size of a wardrobe, fitted with a small shelf that held a tin soldier with a bent sword arm, a child's school report in faded ink, a primer with the name James scrawled in large uncertain letters on the flyleaf, and a leather box. James appeared in the doorway. He looked at what she had found. A very specific look crossed his face, not anger, not embarrassment, but the look of a man who has just accidentally shown someone something he had not meant to show. "Your grandfather's design," Eleanor said. "Mine, actually," James said. "I was 11. I thought I was being remarkably clever." A pause. "I was being remarkably obvious, but no one ever checked." Eleanor looked at the leather box. She did not open it. She looked at it long enough for James to see that she had noticed it, and then she moved back to the main room. "A very good library," she said. And that was when Mrs. Holt arrived from Wyndham Hall. She had followed them to London without being asked on the basis that someone needed to manage the situation, and she stood in the library doorway with her keyring at her waist, and the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years managing the Wyndham family's poor decisions and was not about to stop now. "You," she said to James, "did not invite me to the wedding." James looked at her. "Mrs. Holt." "I bathed you," Mrs. Holt said with perfect dignity. "I dressed your first scrape. I told your mother, on multiple occasions, that you were not as ungovernable as she believed, and you were married in a church without so much as a note sent to tell me. I was informed by Mr. Hollis." "I organised the ceremony in 2 days," James said. "Then you could have used one of those days to send a note." James looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man appealing to the only neutral party in the room. Eleanor looked back at him with entirely false innocence. "I believe," she said, "that Mrs. Holt is right." Mrs. Holt turned to Eleanor with an expression that shifted, in 1 second, from battle-ready to warmly satisfied. "You," she said, "have good sense." She glanced at James. "The Duchess has good sense. Take note." James drank his tea, 1½ sugar cubes, added with the precision of a man who had firm opinions about this and would not be argued out of them, and said nothing further. But he was, for just a moment, trying very hard not to smile. She noticed the portrait on the 3rd day. It hung on the landing of the main staircase, a large oil, the kind that spoke of expense and the assumption of permanence, depicting a man of about 40 in a dark coat with grey-green eyes and a settled expression. The name on the small plaque at the base read, "Edward Wyndham, Duke of Wyndham," and the date was 30 years old. James did not look at it. He passed it every morning and every evening and never once turned his eyes toward it, with the particular deliberateness of a man who has trained himself out of looking at something that used to hurt. Eleanor watched this for 4 days before she said anything. On the 5th morning, she stopped on the landing and looked up at the portrait fully. James came down the stairs behind her and stopped when he found her standing there. "Your father?" she said. "Yes," James said. "You look like him," she said. Something crossed his face. It was brief, and she would not have caught it if she had not been watching. Then it was gone. "I have been told so," he said. He went past her down the stairs without stopping. Eleanor stood on the landing and looked at the portrait of Edward Wyndham for another moment. She thought about a man who cannot look at his own father's face, and what that says about the wound underneath. She filed it in the column where it belonged. It would matter later. She was certain it would matter later. Back at Wyndham Hall, the estate accounts were kept in the study. Eleanor made the mistake of going in 3 weeks after their return because she needed to write a letter, and the writing desk was better there. The ledger was open on the side table. Her eyes moved to it before she had told them not to. She sat down with it. She told herself she was merely curious. 20 minutes later, she looked up and realized she had been working for 20 minutes, and that the discrepancy she had noticed the first night, the figure that balanced but traced back wrong, was not an isolated error. It appeared 7 times across 4 quarterly settlements, each time assigned to a category that could absorb the charge without raising immediate alarm, each time in a slightly different hand from the surrounding entries. This was not an error. She went to find James. He was in the library, reading, or trying to read. He had a book open and his attention somewhere else, a state Eleanor was beginning to recognise. He looked up when she came in. His expression shifted into the one he used when he was preparing to listen to an estate report. "The accounts," Eleanor said, and set the open ledger on his desk. "Eleanor," he began, with the faint tone of a man about to be patient. "Look at this column," she said. She put her finger on the figure, and this one, and traced them back to the quarterly settlement for the 3rd quarter. She turned pages. "This charge is listed against the household account, but the delivery listed in the household account for that week does not exist. There was no delivery. The household register shows nothing. This charge belongs to a trade account, and when you trace it to the trade account, the credit is recorded there as well, with a different reference number." James looked at the page. He looked at the figure. He turned back to the previous page. He called for Mr. Hollis. Mr. Hollis arrived with the precise promptness of a man who considered any other response beneath him. James said, "Mrs. Wyndham has identified an inconsistency in the quarterly accounts. I would like you to review it with her." Mr. Hollis turned his attention to Eleanor. Eleanor showed him the figure. She showed him the trace. She showed him all 7 instances. Mr. Hollis studied the ledger for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Eleanor with an expression that had shifted significantly from his starting position. "These entries have been in the accounts for 16 months, he said. "They were not flagged in either quarterly review." "They would not be," Eleanor said, "unless you were looking for them specifically. The charge is placed in a category that appears correct at first glance. The discrepancy only shows when you trace back to the source records." Mr. Hollis said very carefully, "Mrs. Wyndham, are you suggesting these entries are intentional?" "I am suggesting," Eleanor said, "that they are not accidental." She glanced at James. His expression was no longer the expression he used for estate reports. It was something else. Something careful and new, a look she had not seen on him before. He was looking at her the way she had caught him looking at the father's portrait on the staircase, with something behind it she could not quite name. He said nothing. But from that afternoon forward, when he went into the study and she was not there, he left the side door open. Eleanor wore her first new ball gown. It was deep green silk with cream-coloured trim. The dressmaker had spent 20 minutes on the green, moving swatches against Eleanor's hair and dark eyes with the authority of a professional, and Eleanor had stood on the step and allowed herself to be arranged, and for one small moment had felt something uncomplicated and entirely her own. The Wyndham Winter Assembly was the social marker of the county season, and as Duchess of Wyndham, Eleanor stood beside James at the door and received the county with a composure that only she knew was manufactured. The assembly rooms were bright and warm, the candles reflected in the tall windows, the music from the hired quartet filling the space with the cheerful noise of a room full of people determined to enjoy themselves. She felt Victor before she saw him. It was not a mystical thing. It was simple. She had spent 3 years learning to read his presence in a room, and her body had never unlearned it. She felt him across the room before her eyes found him. When her eyes found him, he was already looking at her. He was speaking to a man she did not recognize, one of Edmund's acquaintances, perhaps, and he smiled at her from across the room with the particular smile he used when he was absolutely certain he had the advantage. An envelope arrived, not delivered by a footman, delivered by her own brother, who was present at the assembly, and who looked confused and slightly apologetic, because the man who had given it to him had said only that it was a message from the estate office that needed Mrs. Wyndham's attention. Eleanor opened it. The note inside was in Victor's handwriting and said only, "You look very well, Eleanor. Save me a waltz." Fury flooded through her, clean and cold and clarifying. She folded the note. She put it in her evening bag. She crossed the room. Victor materialized at her elbow before she had taken 12 steps. "Eleanor," he said, "Mrs. Wyndham, congratulations are in order. The Duke, I never quite saw it." He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes in any meaningful way. He reached out and took her dance card from her wrist. He wrote his name on it. He handed it back. Eleanor took the card. She looked at it. She looked at Victor. The rage inside her was cold and focused and completely under control. She held the dance card up in both hands and she tore it in half. Cleanly, deliberately. She let both halves fall. "I have no card," she said, "and I am promised only to my husband." The nearest corner of the room had gone quiet. People had turned. The music continued, but 4 or 5 conversations had stopped, because something was happening here that was worth watching. Victor's smile did not collapse immediately. It held for exactly 2 seconds. Then it went cold, a different thing entirely from his usual warmth, something underneath the warmth that was calculating and patient and not, Eleanor understood, finished with her yet. James appeared at her side. He had been across the room. She did not know how he had crossed it so quickly. He was simply there, his presence at her back with the same quality the library had at night. Solid and dark, and between her and whatever was coming from the other direction. "Hail," James said. He said it with no emotion at all, which was somehow more effective than anger would have been. Victor looked at James. Something passed between them, a measurement, a record. 2 men with no public quarrel, both knowing exactly what was between them. "Your Grace," Victor said. He was pleasant. He was impeccably pleasant. He retrieved his hat from the cloakroom and left the assembly 20 minutes later. Lavinia appeared at Eleanor's other shoulder. "That," she said, with deep satisfaction, "was magnificent. Can we discuss this over supper? I have been enduring Lord Pennock all evening, and I require a palate cleanser." She kissed him that night. She did not plan it. She was still in the ball gown, her hair half unpinned, the remains of the assembly still in her blood, the adrenaline of the torn card, Victor's cold smile, James appearing at her side. And James was across the room near the window, his coat removed, his cravat loosened, and he was watching her with an expression that was not the mask. She crossed to him. She reached up and she kissed him. He went completely still. She had expected somehow that he would step back, that the mask would come down, that the arrangement would reassert itself between them as a kind of protection. But he did not step back. He stood absolutely still and let her. He had the quality of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting for it. Eleanor kissed him for a moment that lasted long enough to matter. When she stepped back, the room was very quiet. James said, "The assembly was 3 years ago tonight, the last time I danced with someone other than myself." Eleanor looked at him. That was not what she had expected him to say. "That is a terrible way to describe dancing alone in a library," she said. "I was describing dancing at the last assembly," he said, "before Henry died, and I became something I was not intended to be. I was there, and you were not. You had gone to spend the season in Haverwick, I was told, and I thought, even then, that the room was less interesting for it." She stared at him. "I noticed you," he said, "before I should have, before anything had happened. That is all I am saying." He said it with no ornamentation. He said it the way he said everything true, flat and certain and completely without performance. Eleanor thought, standing in the lamplight in the green silk ball gown she had bought with his money, that she could love this man. She thought it clearly and directly, the way her father had taught her to record a figure that balanced. She was not surprised by the thought. She was only surprised that it had taken this long. "James," she said. He looked at her. "I think you should probably tell me about your brother," she said. "Not now, but soon." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Perhaps." He went to the settee and sat with his book. Eleanor changed behind the screen and went to bed. But she fell asleep thinking about a man in a library dancing alone, and all the years between then and now, and how close they had come to simply never intersecting at all. For the first time she realized she had something to lose. Mr. Hollis arrived with the envelope on a Tuesday. He carried it the way he carried everything consequential, level, both hands, with the formality of a man who understood the weight of what he was transporting. He set it on James's desk and said, "This has been held at the estate since your Grace was 6 years old. The conditions of its release were written in the old Duke's instructions to the household. It was to be given to James Wyndham upon the occasion of his marriage. As your Grace has now fulfilled that condition, it falls to me to deliver it." James looked at the envelope. He looked at Mr. Hollis. He said nothing. Mr. Hollis bowed and left the room. Eleanor was sitting across the desk with the estate ledger. She had been at it since breakfast, working through the quarterly accounts with the systematic patience her father had given her, and she was watching James's face as he picked up the envelope. She could see the handwriting on the outside from where she sat. She did not say anything. James opened it. He unfolded the letter first. He read it once. He set it down and read it again. His hands were still. His face was still. Eleanor had never seen this particular quality